Hello, everyone. We're gonna start. My name is Jaime Aguilar. I'm a professor of history over at Midland College. And before we start, I'd like to thank Professor Antonio Moreno of the Spanish department, who works tirelessly to bring some sense of Spanish culture, but Latin American culture and Hispanic culture throughout the United States. Just to show you, there used to be a Mexican historian here, a physician that's not here. There's Dr. Perry, who's been one of the big supporters of Mexican Tejano culture. And it's a labor of love for them, as it is for me. But we have a salary, our hourly wage. If you saw the hourly wage, you know if you're going to be a Spanish professor, cover professor, history professor. But we work for the love of our field, and that's the best part. We read and study that which we love the most, but you work for free, right? And you have to beg for money, and Dr. Moreno has to approach the administration every year to bring scholars from all over the United States and throughout Latin America, which is no small task. And he helped me out bring a speaker to Midland College last semester. I had no idea I was going to work that much for free. But it came out really well with his guidance. So can we have a round of applause for Dr. Perry? And Dr. Perry, the postdoctor. And so you always have to thank the money. We'd like to thank the Odessa Council for the Arts and Humanities and the UTPB College of Arts and Sciences. So now we'll get on to Dr. Sergio Gutierrez Negron, who's an associate professor of Hispanic Studies at Oberlin College, which is comparable to West Texas in terms of flatness.
For sure.
Just minus the mesquite. Dr. Gutierrez Negron's scholarship analyzes the crossroads of economic discourse, literature, and conservative cultural production in 19th century Mexico. And 19th century Mexico makes West Texas look like a Bernie Sanders guided area. It's a very conservative time period. I don't think people understand how conservative Mexican politics is and continues to this day. His forthcoming book, which is coming out summer 2023 from Vanderbilt University Press, which has one of the most important Latin American sections from University Press, Mexico Interrupted, Labor, Idleness, and the Economic Imaginary of Independence. And the book covers more or less the Mexican era of independence, which is we celebrate 1810, but it really finishes in 1821, comparable here in the United States. We battled Yorktown 1783, and we celebrate 1776. But 1821 to 1854, which is a very important period, an understudied period in Mexican history. So this book is a very important contribution to a very important but misunderstood time period in Mexican history. Now, he's also a novelist. He's published 4 novels. The last one, Los Días Hábiles, which is our daily lives. Los Días Hábiles.
Sure, yeah, Hábiles in working days.
Working days. And he's working on another novel currently on the Haitian Revolution and its impact on Puerto Rico. And Haiti is going to be, you're going to start hearing a lot about Haiti, that was the second nation in the Americas to earn its independence in 1807. But it was independence was won by slaves, enslaved peoples from sub-Saharan Africa who spoke different languages, but they were inspired by the ideals of the American Revolution and the French Revolution. It's a very understudied period in global history, and so that's what his next novel is about. He was also a journalist for 9 years, and he had columns published in Cuba, Colombia, Argentina, Armenia, and Puerto Rico as well. Puerto Rico, by the way, is part of the United States, not a separate country. FYI, because Africa is not a continent. I just had a student ask me that the other day. But there is a tradition in Latin America for Latin American writers, historians, not just be historians, literary critics, not just be literary critics. Really, the influence, say, of Mark Twain, Jack London, who were writers, transdisciplinary writers, and there's still, that's a very rich tradition that the professor here continues as a journalist, as a novelist, and as an academic. So I'm going to shut up now and let him go.
Thank you very much. I want to repeat the thanks to Antonio, to the Latin American Writers Series, to the College of Arts and Sciences here in UTPB and the Odessa Council for the Arts and the Humanities. I really appreciate the invitation, and I've really enjoyed my visit since yesterday. Mostly because it's warm, and Ohio right now is still very, very cold. But anyways, my talk today is titled Mexican Idleness, a Cultural Inquiry. It was originally called Cultural History, but I decided to cut away the documents because it was getting too, I'm gonna limit it to an inquiry, let's say. And it's based, like the professor said, on this book it's a very small section of this book that's coming out. So I just wanted to take it out and explore the topic a little bit more. What I will be doing is engaging with a stereotype, a myth, a trope, an image, according to which there is a particular form of Mexican idleness. According to this myth, everybody everywhere can be lazy, but there is a particular peculiar form in which Mexicans echan la hueva. This exceptionality is, of course, false, right? This is a false, like all stereotypes, it's a false myth. But this does not make it any less historical. This myth of a Mexican idleness is polyvalent. Like all myths, it hides multiple it has multiple genealogies, multiple histories, multiple beginnings. And I will only be tracing some of these today, especially those that have to do with how the myth developed in Mexico. So I'm not really going to be talking too much about the US myth, but I'm going to start with like a brief account of the US myth, of this idea of Mexican idleness, how it, what is deployed in the US, how it developed, and then I will go into my topic, which is how did this idea, this myth, this stereotype become essential for Mexico as an independent nation and for the stories elites told themselves about this nation they had just founded. Well, yeah. The stereotype, exactly as I mentioned, the stereotype of the lazy Mexican in the US has its own damaging history, and it differs from the myth in Mexico. In the US, the stereotype is the product of a series of historical tropes and displacements that converge with nationalistic affects, and its roots are mostly double. You could say that there's two trends that come together in this myth. On the one hand, it is an expression of European and later US ideas about the laziness of natives, whether these be African or indigenous. This was like a recurrent idea in Europe and then in the US and the Americas, right? The idea that Africans and natives of all types lived in such a natural richness that they were lazy because they could, grab fruit from the nearest tree. So it's like a myth that natives were lazy or were idle. On the other hand, this myth is it reactivates an Anglo and Northern European derision of the Southerner. In the Europe of the 17th and 18th century, increasingly industrialized nation states put industriousness as a central value. Kingdoms, right? In the story these countries told themselves, or these kingdoms, empires, etc., industrialization, which began around the 17th century in its earliest iterations, industrialization was not a cultural and economic project, but the inevitable result of industriousness and of the postponement of pleasure. So industriousness and industrialization was like a moral quality. Societies like Spain and southern Italy, so anything to the south of Europe in the orange triangle-ish, societies like Spain and southern Italy that did not conform to the economic realities of northern Europe and their values must in this story be defective in one way or another. The primary defect was laziness, Northern Europeans surmised. Southerners were not good workers. Southerners took siestas, etc. French philosophers like Montesquieu took this farther and argued that there were, in fact, climatological reasons for these forms of idleness. For Montesquieu, warm, dry places were lazy, colder, more temperate places were productive, were industrious, right? Through these logics, Southern Europe was brought into closer proximity to Africa. Their mores, their manners, their form of being, closer to that of natives. A particular form of these anti-Southern ideas focused on Spain. Many Anglo-Northern European and later US nationals created a direct link between Spain's failure as an empire in the 18th and 19th century. They tied Spain's imperial failure to Catholicism, for sure, and that's a different story, but more importantly to its southern say, lazy customs. So for 19th century US Americans, Mexicans were not only racialized subjects, indigenous and mestizos, or mixed, and therefore like the native and the African in theory, lazy, but they also shared their vices of their Spanish forebears, both cultural and religious. In this sense, Mexicans were racially and culturally predisposed to idleness. These logics, of course, serve to justify American exceptionalism and expansionism in the face of the aftermath of the US-Mexico War. Not only the aftermath, in the rising tensions that led to the US-Mexico War, the war which, among many other states, made Texas a US territory, as you all know. These logics also justified the cultural animus that congealed in those very same territories towards the end of the 19th century with anti-Hispanic policies and discourses. So in the US, you have these ideas that come from Europe, become ingrained in US discourse, and then as the US starts looking southward, they start projecting them to Mexicans, right? So that's basically like a very brief story of how the myth was developed in the US. The national story in Mexico is different. And it's tied to independence. It emerged shortly after independence at the hands of new national elites obsessed with the increasingly frustrating and anxiety-ridden question of how to yield the prosperity promised by a territory that they considered to be naturally rich, but which compared to the United States remained undeveloped. So in other words, you had elites after independence that were convinced that Mexico was rich in resources. The land is rich. And if our land is rich, why is our economy not developing just like the US economy, right? So these people tried to figure out what was happening. But before that, let's talk about independence. Mexican independence, which took place in 1821, like the professor said, was an economic event. From the earliest days of the insurgency in 1810, images of Spanish economic and fiscal exploitation were used to legitimize the uprising and its demands. After a decade-long war, the economic promises of independence built a common ground between different sectors of the population. Most, if not all, Mexicans, whether elite or popular, imagined separation from Spain before and during its first decades as a feat that nationalized or that could have nationalized a rich and productive economic apparatus. A new independent era of territorial sovereignty and autonomy was supposed to have guaranteed that the providential wealth of the land, its plentiful resources, and the labor of its people sustained the existence, survival, and improvement of a just state and polity. Freed from restraints, they believed, it was only a matter of time until the new Mexican nation would, and I quote like an official document, would shine its bright beacon of liberty over Europe, the United States, and all other nations of the globe. So for a second there, just after independence, Mexican independent elites thought that Mexico was the one place in which you had a country, I mean, of course they were ignoring Haiti. Everyone was ignoring what was happening in Haiti and the Haitian Revolution, so it wasn't part of they knew what was happening, but they were intentionally ignoring it. But Mexican elites thought that Mexico is the one place in the Americas, in the hemisphere, in which there was complete freedom. In theory, this is in theory, slavery was abolished in 1810 by Hidalgo. In practice, that's not actually the case, but but because slavery had been nominally abolished, and now suddenly there was no constraints of labor, Mexico could be the future of the Americas. These expectations did not materialize, of course. The next half century would be marked by economic crisis, political instability, foreign interventions, like a war with the US, but first a French invasion, then a Spanish invasion, then a war with the US, and eventually a bloody civil war. In its first months of existence, though, the new Mexican state fulfilled some of the promises it had made. It dissolved many of the viceregal fiscal instruments that survived the war, cut taxes and duties, paid the armies, and nationalized all of the standing debts this viceroyalty owed to remaining moneyed interests, whether local or international. The unspoken expectations behind such moves was that soon enough silver would fill and overflow the national coffers. The opposite happened, though. The decade of insurgency that went from 1810 to 1821 disarticulated the viceregal economy, and in the meantime, the international panorama changed drastically. From having been one of the engines of silver commercial capitalism in the 18th century, its treasury rich enough to sustain its own dynamic society, support Spain's Caribbean possessions and the Philippines, all the while transferring its surpluses to the metropolis, the now Mexican territory suddenly discovered itself incapable of paying its armed forces, meeting its fiscal obligations, or fulfilling its end in multiple national and foreign loans. In other words, after independence, the Mexican economy spiraled downward, and its ruling elites spent much of the following decades trying to regain the economic prosperity that had characterized the 18th century. And sometimes we often don't know how rich the economy in Mexico was in the 18th century, right? The silver coming out from Mexico spurred development all through the world, mostly funneled through Spain, right? It produced so much money, so much silver, and so much wealth that it could sustain the Mexican economy. Basically, the Mexican mines sustained Cuba and Puerto Rico as Spanish possessions, and what remained of that money sustained Philippines at the other side of the world, and also sustained Spain. So it was a really powerful economy, and elites thought that that would now be theirs, right? That's what Mexico was founded on, the idea that these things could now be nationalized. Mexican elites found themselves then in a material and intellectual bind. The territory's wealth and the myth of Mexico's proverbial riches had been constitutive elements in the making of Creole subjectivities. While this myth of natural plenitude that has been present as a rhetorical trope since Hernán Cortés's early chronicles in the 16th century, it had not been until the latter half of the 18th century when the myth expanded to the rhythm of the spectacular boom of silver and gold mines that fueled the rise of global capitalism. When Francisco Javier Clavijero and other enlightened criollos' discursive defense and apology of the territory served as the ideological foundation for Creole political imaginaries, the mining boom that centered global silver capitalism in the Mexican heartland served as the material foundation for the Creole economic imaginaries that after 1821 became the economic imaginaries of independence. In more than one sense, it was Alexander von Humboldt's political essay on the Kingdom of New Spain, which allowed the myth's transference to and operativity within these economic imaginaries. The political essay did more than simply confirm the patriotic beliefs of an earlier generation of Creole lettered men. It proved them scientifically by mobilizing the power of statistics for their cause. So Humboldt is this Prussian scientist that comes to he's already famous, he comes to the Americas, he goes through different countries in Latin America and kind of writes scientific essays using statistics and really information he gathered from local scientists and populations, and produced these reports that then had a lot of influence, both Europe and the Latin Americas, and in the Americas. The political essay did more than simply confirm these patriotic beliefs of lettered men. It proved them scientifically by mobilizing science for their cause. To the glee of Mexican pro-independence elites, despite the dismal present, the Prussian predicted a prosperous future for Mexico. The nation's imminent place as an economic giant was guaranteed by its territorial extension, the diversity of climates, the fecundity of its soil, its mineral riches, and its commercial location between two oceans. This potential for Humboldt was being held back only by the unenlightened administration of Spain and its deleterious effects on the territory's social and political life. The Creole ruling elite also took another element of the political essay to heart. For Humboldt, Mexico's proverbial wealth could easily sustain a population that was 10 times its size. Such demographic capacity was deeply connected to its potential, insofar as, put to work, it would generate economic demand, production, and lead to the general well-being of the nation. Surely, the interrelationship between population and economic development predated the political essay and had been an essential element of mercantilist programs of the 18th century. Yet again, Humboldt's scientific approach and sheer enthusiasm provided a different emphasis, one which strengthened claims and structured the expectations and policies of post-independence political class. For these men, reading Humboldt, or reading those who had read Humboldt, if one bracketed the political and institutional restraints the Prussian scientists critiqued, what remained was the image of a natural plenitude presently undercut by demographic scarcity. This idea of a demographically scarce or underpopulated Mexico would deepen in light of the biological cost of the War of Independence, and would soon ground the certainty of an underpopulated Mexico. It was taken as a fact that Mexico was underpopulated. This certainty launched the fevered quest among elites for economic measures and policies to expedite the necessary peopling of a territory on which the new state's providential future depended. In other words, one of the most important things they took from Humboldt, or the second most important thing, is this idea that Mexico needed more people. And even though I'm not talking about this today, this is profoundly tied to Texas, because the first people to get the first person to be approved of a land grant to enrich, to grow the Mexican population was Stephen Austin, who got the first was first American to get official land grants from Mexico. And the idea is that Americans that were already crossing the border illegally would now be legalized and become part of the Mexican nation. So they had to swear allegiance to Mexico, in theory. We know how that ended up. These economic imaginaries, these ideas, were emphatically elite Creole imaginaries. This is no surprise if we consider that the post-independence public life was dominated by the approximately 2,000 or so men whom Eric Van Young calls the political nation. This Creole political nation represented a minority not only in the urban spaces it largely occupied and from where it wielded its powers, but also in the national territory as a whole. Out of approximately 6.1 million inhabitants at the close of the 18th century, some 60% or 3.7 million were indigenous. According to Yasnaya Elena Hill, which is Yasnaya Elena Hill is a linguist and sociologist, indigenous sociologist in Mexico. This means that only about 2.4 or 40% of the Mexican population were actually Spanish-speaking, or at the very least bilingual. So when we're talking about Mexico and how this country was being built as a Spanish-speaking country, the truth is that only 40% of the population even spoke Spanish. And the political class, the voting population, was more around 200,000 men, right? Because women didn't have the right to vote. Thus, elite anxiety over the performance of the economy was inevitably tied to the fact that the economic strength of this new nation state was limited by the very minority status of the culturally Creole population. For this reason, the economic horizon of post-independence policies, politics, and discourse always entailed the subsumption not only of the territory, but of the existing population and the transformation and modernization of its customs. In truth, as Alan Knight has written about another context, the problem faced by these elites was not necessarily the lack or quality of working bodies, but that these bodies that populated the now Mexican territory were recalcitrant. That is, still paraphrasing Knight, Indians with subsistence holdings did not readily abandon their land to take up wage labor, and Central Mexicans, though dispossessed and proletarianized, were not ruthless enough to follow the demand and imperatives of a labor market that was supposed to drive the dreams of this elite nation. Surely, shortages of labor were oftentimes related to demographic scarcity and density, but they also had to do with the fact that the total population had not been transformed into that detached reservoir of labor that grounded ideas of capitalist free labor. In other words, what was often at stake in these economic imaginaries was not simply the question of the economic well-being and development of the nation, and they called it aggrandizement in this period, but of the national and capitalist accumulation of the territory and its population. In Mexico, the myth of the proverbial wealth of the land and the certainty of demographic scarcity played a magical role for the Creole elite. These myths flattened the territory and its histories, erasing the genealogies of indigenous settlement and forms of life, as well as the regional, national, and international commercial networks and markets that had activated past economic gains, and the forms of labors and modes of production that had in the past and present exploited these riches. The economic imaginaries of independence then generated a multiplicity of economic narratives that attempted to articulate the harmonious story of the economic future of the nation. What was at stake in these narratives and the conceptual apparatuses produced by elites was not simply the nation's production, but also the production of Mexico as a collective entity, as a national market, and the Mexican as a particular form of subjectivity. In this context of a supposedly underpopulated, naturally wealthy territory, the Creole elite's fate and the development of Mexico depended on and was threatened by the masses. This had always been the case, of course, but now the narrative elites told themselves, about themselves, had to acknowledge it, had to build around it. And they looked around their cities and they saw, sure, many laboring men and women, but they also saw what seemed like a lot of people not at work. The categories through which Creole elites thought about these people not at work, the category they used and through which they conceptualized the people not at work was the vagrant. This is so how they would talk about. I'm going to talk now about actual policy, especially actual local policy, and how they talk about the idleness was as vagrancy, right? In Spanish, vagancia, it's still used, it's used more than vagrancy. We don't talk about, my friend is a vagrant, right? But you can say in Spanish, my friend is un vago. And it's not ambiguous in Spanish. In English, it's a little bit. During the first half of the 19th century, the vagrant haunted all figuration of labor in Mexico. Elites described him as an able-bodied man of productive age who did not toil the fields or engage in honest employment, despite the economic downturn and the national scarcity of labor. Most often of indigenous extraction or mestizo, the vagrant, they believed, would rather loaf and loiter than respond to the economic imperatives and republican duties on which the new nation attempted to found itself. The vagrant was not yet or necessarily a criminal. It was not illegal to be unemployed, but it was only a matter of time until somebody who was not employed crossed the law, seeing as all honest living called for a trade, office, or occupation. Convinced as they were about the lack of hands and the underpopulation that interrupted Mexico's economic future in the aftermath of independence, the vagrant quickly became the urban figure through which Creole statesmen could not, the figure that they could not risk to ignore. So it becomes like an obsession. You can't, you read congressional debates, you read local legislation, and they're obsessed with this myth, this idea of the vagrant. Soon after anti-vagrancy, the capture and transformation of the idler, of the vagrant, became a quintessential administrative practice, close to an obsession for Mexican elites and politicians. Anti-vagrancy began to function as a conceptual resolution to what the elite saw as a problem of development in a post-war economy, plagued by the scarcity of free labor, as well as pre-capitalistic habits. Transformed into policy, anti-vagrancy generated the legal devices necessary for the forced transformation of men into workers, for the sculpting out of the idle masses of a standing reserve of labor. So what happens in a regular anti-vagrancy operation is the legislature actually calls the police, tells them to go through the city and pick up anybody that's not working and put them to jail, and then we'll figure out what to do with them. But this is problematic because how do you know somebody is unemployed or intentionally unemployed or simply taking a break, right? So that ambiguity becomes problematic. Unfortunately for elites, at the center of anti-vagrancy beat a hermeneutical question about the possibility of dispelling the opacity of the social. That is, how can I, a member of the elite, look at a person and know if they are in fact an unemployed idler and not somebody carrying out some other form of labor? How do I know it's not a servant waiting for their employer to finish a house call, etc.? The difficulty of this scene of discernment was destined to undermine elite dreams of a republic of labor and its concomitant police state. At the center of anti-vagrancy, there's this scene of discernment I just described. You, the elite critic or moralist, look at somebody, and you have to go through a mental checklist to identify the person as an idler or vagrant. In more formal terms, the scene of discernment is the precise conceptual and spatial-temporal instance in which the lived activity of people comes into the purview of authorities that then determine, classify, and engage it through schemas of abstract labor. These scenes were quintessential for anti-vagrancy as it depended on the transparency of the social, on the capacity to verify and fabricate a warranted assertion about the truth of a person's character, about the nature of industriousness, and as a result discern or rather produce the vagrant. It was precisely the question of vagrancy's transparency, of the capacity to be able to identify somebody who was not at work, who did not work, which on March 1827, for example, brought the Mexican Congress's Chamber of Deputies into a standstill. A federal raid against vagrants in Mexico City had gone wrong earlier that month and had mistakenly rounded up many an honest working man along with the idle. According to a witness, under the guise of anti-vagrancy, public individual liberties had been trampled, and I quote from a document, in a way that the empire of despotism, which would have carried out a similar scandal, did not. In other words, people were saying, we're now no longer under the power of a despot, and still we have these despotic practices going around. Gangs of men employed by neighborhood lieutenants by the police. This witness reported roamed city streets at all hours and on a whim detained any man with the pretext of checking their occupational status. Before detainees had the chance to provide proof of employment, these men illegally apprehended them and transported them to a jail. There, the detainees would waste away for a day or two, and nobody would try to prove that they were in fact unemployed. An angry congressman insisted that the victims had been the working poor, not vagrants. The botched raid then had devolved, according to this congressman, into the persecution of good, honest citizens and miserable artisans who have the need to roam the streets with no other qualification than their poor and humble clothes. So the people that were put to jail were artisans, people who made shoes, who made hats, etc. So actually employed people. Nobody that was taken into this prison was actually confirmed to be a vagrant. The congressman concluded indignant that his constituency was now full of terror at the sight of the mischief and arbitrariness that had been and continued to be committed in the name of a Republican and free government. This sentiment echoed in turn in both chambers of Congress, where the members openly condemned the procedures of this operation and insisted that changes to anti-vagrancy legislation were necessary. Situations like this would be repeated often and through the centuries. It kept happening, the same stories kept happening. And many legislators actually took it seriously, tried to reform the institution, but always hit the same wall. Others, most in fact, argued that any interruption to anti-vagrancy raid would be more detrimental than its opposite. Yet none of the public outcry in this 1827 case or later placed the blame on anti-vagrancy practice itself. Even the most critical accounts focused on the procedures through which anti-vagrancy was deployed and on the scene of discernment itself. All would have agreed that in principle, vagrancy, understood as idleness, hacked at the foundation of the Republic. They insisted, after all, that the real vagrants had vanished or escaped. What worried them was the reality that a misinformed anti-vagrancy procedure was damaging the very public happiness in the name of which it was carried out. Their claims, then, were driven by an implicit demand for a more thorough, a more nuanced anti-vagrancy practice, a practice capable of matching vagrancy's tenacity while at the same time remaining true to Republican rights. These politicians crafted new laws over and over again that targeted the real vagrant, the intentional vagrant, and when these laws failed, they crafted newer laws ad nauseum. This happens over 100 years. In spite of the continuous attempts at definition, the truth of the matter was that the policy they crafted said very little about the actually existing urban population. By 1851, the leading newspaper of Mexico City, at least del siglo XIX, would offer a potential hermeneutical schema for the dissipation of this opacity. The schema would be containing what Lucio Ernesto Maldonado Ojeda, historian, calls the new conception of vagrancy, one fully crisscrossed by sociological and economic purview and ideas. The newspaper's editors argued, following a Spanish economist, that what had been referred to as vagrancy, as idleness, when we talk about idleness, they argued, we actually were talking about two things. We were talking about two different things, voluntary idleness and forced idleness. So for them, voluntary idleness was when somebody made the decision of actually not working. Voluntary idleness was the problem. It's the person who does not work, who's lazy, and who could be working and is not. Forced, and that's the one we should persecute. We should be forcing people to work. If we find somebody that's unemployed, we should force them into, working whatever we, the government, think is productive. So that's what the problem. The problem for these editors was that all these policies that were being created were actually targeting people that were forced into idleness. And what forced people into idleness? On the lack of work, underemployment, the economic situation. So we have to differentiate between somebody who is intentionally not working and somebody who's not working because they can't find a job. The problem is once you do this differentiation, the actual policy falls apart, because how do you differentiate between one and the other? In fact, every time that they said, oh, okay, this time around we just caught a bunch of real lazy people, people who are voluntarily not working, and then these people always were able to prove their work. They had to live, they had to eat something. So everyone was able normally to prove some type of honest employment. Oftentimes, because of the economic situation, these people were underemployed. They could not work, every day of the week, et cetera, et cetera. But everyone managed to prove their work. But, right. Ironically, even if the newspaper's editors called for the persecution of voluntary vagrancy, their opening of the category to history, to sociological and economic concerns, liquidated its potential. After all, as many historians have shown, most cases processed through anti-vagrancy courts were, unsurprisingly, in light of the economic and political panorama of post-independence Mexico, cases of forced vagrancy. Of course, as we have seen, elites were blind to these qualifications and would consistently complain that witnesses provided by these people considered to be vagrants must be false. The system is broken. Yet, despite the many deliberative innovations to anti-vagrancy, the results yielded continued this trend. Ultimately, the recognition of a form of opaque vagrancy, one which was not what it seemed because it did not entirely emerge from a willful or individual decision, ignored the fact that even the most intentional forms of vagrancy were equally opaque, equally subject to contextual exigencies and contingencies. Lettered elites, of course, did not give up when faced with these difficulties. In their attempts to understand the reasons behind voluntary idleness and to write policy to address it, they had long turned to matters of culture and customs. Like their European counterparts, for some critics, the problem with the Mexican citizenry had both to do with Spanish oppression and the indigenous lineage and culture of the nation. Many liberals held that Spain had not only damaged the population of Hispanic extraction by instilling their defective and unproductive manners, but had also reduced the indigenous to apathy and laziness through centuries of patronizing paternalism. So in other words, now that the policy is failing, or as the policy failed, they came up with these explanations as to why. Where does this laziness come from? And liberals argued what I just said. Liberals also argued that Spain's forced monopoly isolated the transatlantic Spanish Empire from the free market had twisted Spanish Americans' natural propensity to labor and had also damaged their entrepreneurial spirit. Others, such as the conservative editors of El Universal, argued that national idleness had little to do with Spain and more to do with indigenous apathy. For them, the problem was the Indian himself. They identified two main areas of conflict within all the indigenous cultures of Mexico. On the one hand, they argued that the indigenous did not participate in the economy beyond forms of bartering, and that this bartering was non-economic because it did not achieve a surplus, that these practices lacked forethought and planning and thus only served to satisfy immediate needs. On the other, the indigenous, they argued, were invested in what the Universal considered antisocial attachments to land and language. By rejecting Spanish as lingua franca and becoming obsessed with land, the indigenous short-circuited all politics, which in turn resulted in the complete indifference to any form of organized government, collective planning, and a complete lack of any demand beyond the desire not to be taxed. Put together, these supposedly indigenous cultural traits impaired the postponement for these people. These traits impaired the postponement of gratification that traditionally was understood to ground industriousness. Thus, in this account, it was indigenous culture which interrupted the development of a national industriousness. For the editors of El Universal and many others, a national program of education focused on the acculturation of the indigenous with the destruction of indigenous culture could actually aid anti-vagrancy policy in transforming the habits and cultures of the masses and finally dispelling Mexican idleness. As we can see, both the narrative of Spanish vices and the narrative of indigenous apathy culturalized, that is, interpreted as cultural, problems that were really sociological and economic, such as unemployment, underemployment, geographical displacement, individual choice, among others. These narratives targeted particular groups, surely, but were not entirely or not yet racial narratives. Because for the elites, education, discipline, and strong government oversight could still solve these through the expansion of and the inculcation of proper habits. So these are not necessarily racial narratives yet. I mean, there is a racial argument about the indigenous, but the indigenous can be, the problem is their manners, not their race or any scientific language. This problem of science comes in the last third of the 19th century. By this period, by the last third of the 19th century, the consistent failure of anti-vagrancy and educational policy, the tenacity of indigenous affirmation, and the will of a population that would not cede their freedoms to elite aspirations reduced many members of the national elite to a pessimistic misanthropy. And this pessimistic misanthropy, in turn, served as a fertile ground on which positivistic and scientific, not scientific, ideas about racial difference and natural determinism sprouted. If by the mid-century the sociological problem of a lack of work was culturalized, interpreted as cultural, by the end of the century it was naturalized, understood as the nature of a people. As an example, let us turn to our friend Justo Sierra, one of the optimistic and less racist and misanthropic of the positivists, the less racist and misanthropic. Still, of course. For Sierra, the problem of Mexican idleness had two aspects. The idleness of the mestizo or Hispanic population was presented as cultural, as we had said before, as having to do with Spanish influence as before. The idleness of the indigenous, however, was complicated and had to be explained by science. On the one hand, Sierra argued that indigenous metabolism, and let's note the physiological argument, the physiological language, indigenous metabolism had been annihilated by the Spanish conquest, submerging it into an unwholesome passivity that reduced the Indio life process to the exploitative conditions of animals of labor, right? This is his argument. The indigenous were actually resilient. So this is him defending the indigenous, right? Their metabolism is broken because of Spanish influence, but they're actually resilient, they're strong, because even though they're poor, they keep having kids. This is an actual scientific argument, right? So that's how he argued it. Moreover, indigenous passivity was not simply a matter of racial determinism, Sierra continued, but of a natural adaptation to an inhospitable environment. And he argued that living in the Mesa Central and its hills, as well as in the hot climates of the coasts, la familia indígena vive sumergida en un medio debilitante, la atmósfera de las alturas insuficientemente pesada para las necesidades normales. That is, it was now the Mexican environment and climatological conditions which impaired the development of industriousness. Moreover, Sierra held that these habitats, which the indigenous called their own, not only the indigenous, but mostly the indigenous, were insufficient for something essential, the elaboration of basically a meat-eating diet, but he calls it an economy based on cattle. The problem with these environments was that they reduced the indigenous diet to a diet made of corn, chile, fruits as an only option. So now it was not only the problem with Mexican industry had not only to do with the land, with cultural habits. Now it also had to do with good food, with the actual food that people ate. This diet, he concluded, was essentially rudimentary, guaranteeing only mere survival and precluding a chance of an active metabolism. In other words, for Sierra and other positivists, the Mexican landscape was in part guilty of the idleness of the people that populated it. The climatological aspects of some of its regions and the diet that these produced affected the physiological metabolism of a population and thus led to a general state of idleness. Put simply, Sierra concluded that it was mostly nature and not culture or the economy that was to blame for Mexican idleness, and these were things that could be fixed by a strong government, right? So if it's a diet that's a diet based on corn that's actually making us not productive, then as a government we can develop a cattle economy and make everyone eat meat and problem solved. I mean, plus education, etc., etc. But now it was the food. To conclude, with the intensification of the modernizing zeal during the last quarter of the 19th century, the battle against idleness continued to be a central concern. Anti-vagrancy was still present in the 1871 Penal Code and continued well into the 20th century, along with newer, more modern forms of policing industriousness. Anti-vagrancy disappeared from the Mexican Penal Code around 1935. So these ideas started in the beginning of the early 19th century, but actually lasted well into the 20th century. Accompanying it, explaining it, justifying it, were the myths about Mexican idleness we have traced, cultural, economic, and scientific narratives that sought to explain Mexican underdevelopment. In a sense, the tenacity of culture and the fatalism of science, which grounded these myths, provided some release. These myths explained why elite attempts had failed consistently. These myths shifted the blame to the masses and avoided questioning the social, economic, and political righteousness of developmental policy. Ultimately, most, if not all, members of the Creole elite and the political nation were incapable of seeing Mexico for what it was: a society composed in its majority of indigenous communities, of Indian and mestizo peasants and artisans, and legions of unpaid soldiers, all of whom labored without respite, with the hope not of leading the nation into a providential future of economic development, but of simply making do. Thank you.
Before we open it up for questions, I'd just like to provide you with some historical context, which is what I do, put people to sleep with history facts. But when we talk about Criollos are within the colonial era, Spanish colonial era, more or less 1521 conquest of the Mexica, the Aztecs, to 1810, 1821 within Mexico. It's going to be Mexico. Criollos are Spaniards born in the Americas. Not related, say, Creoles in Louisiana. It's very different. But in Latin America, in the Spanish colonial era, that there were multiple hierarchies. There was a legal hierarchy where Criollos and Peninsulares Spaniards born in Spain, were legally the same. But culturally, Peninsulares Spaniards were much higher rank and had many more economic opportunities. And then Criollos were below them. But to give you an example, indigenous peoples, especially the descendants of the Mexica, the Aztecs, their ranking was right under the Criollos. And sometimes legally they had higher legal ranking, but in practice, they were at the bottom. And sometimes indigenous people were worse off, had less freedoms, less opportunities than the small African enslaved population, particularly southeastern Mexico. What's going to happen is the majority of the population today, Mexico, we identify people of Mexican descent, we identify as mestizo, which includes everybody, which was really a forced on the Mexican people, Mexican society after the Mexican Revolution, which is the equivalent to our Civil War, that takes place in 1920. That's important to understand during this period. And even though Criollos are running Mexico in the 19th century, there's still a tremendous amount of racism. That a Spaniard would still have more opportunities, Spanish immigrant, than say a Criollo who took part in the Mexican independence era. And then it's also important to understand from an economic standpoint, Mexican labor or Spanish colonial labor was the foundation for the European Industrial Revolution. The Spaniards were conquerors, but they were traders. They built very little. So they would exploit the Americas, or in the Philippines, and some of the other colonies, and they would trade that mineral wealth to the industrialized Northern Europe, the English, the Dutch, the Northern German principalities. So the Spanish built very little, although it was a very successful empire. Consequently, they left in Mexico, in 19th century Mexico, a system that was in shambles economically. It's a tremendous amount of wealth. You might want to compare it in terms of expectation, like the professor started, that why is Mexico so poor? Why are there so many poor people? None of you are going to remember, some of us can remember the first Iraq War. And the promise of the first Iraq War was, we're going to take over, we're going to invade Iraq and take it over, actually the second one as well. The second Iraq War, we're going to knock off Saddam Hussein. There's going to be so much oil that the Western world is going to be able to immediately use the oil for rebuilding Iraq and the Middle East. And it was in shambles, the infrastructure. And that was Mexico during the early 19th century. Tremendous amount of wealth, but in shambles. So it's important to understand that Mexican labor was at the foundation of the Industrial Revolution, which contributes to the English Empire, the United States American Revolution, and then the stabilization of particularly Central Europe.
I mean, the common coin in 18th century is the peso that's coined in Mexico. It's actually used in the U.S. until the foundation of the dollar. It's like a common, like a stable currency.
So, with all of that being said, for anyone who's awake because of me, does anyone have any questions? Go, Chris. Introduce yourself, Chris.
I'm Chris Brown. I'm Department Chair of English and Language Arts at Liverpool College, colleague of the great Jaime Aguilar.
Okay.
And I was just wondering, does the Protestant work ethic factor into some of this prejudicial stereotyping of Mexican idleness?
Right. So let's see where I can approach that from. So if the part I said I didn't talk about was like this idea of bringing in settlers, colonos, right? Among which you have Stephen Austin, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of the Mexican politicians, the same Mexican politicians that are involved in crafting these laws against idleness, they're traveling through the US and Europe and trying to invite people over, right? And there's two, what they wanted was mostly Catholic Irish, like a Catholic, to bring Catholic Irish people into Mexico because they would mix better with like the Catholic culture of Mexico, the same Catholic Germans, etc., etc. But what was coming were Protestant Americans, really, that had they had to convert in theory to Catholicism, but when people actually went and wrote reports, they're like, these people are still Protestant. And there's a strand of politicians that actually start believing in this idea of a Protestant work ethic. It's like, okay, what's making these people productive is that their religion. So let's try. Mexico had a law that you could only be Catholic, right? So there is some people that start believing this idea of a Protestant work ethic. But there's two stories to these settlements that were being settled, especially by Protestants in Mexico. There's the official story of like these are very productive farming yeomen that are coming Protestant and starting their colonies. And then when Mexico actually sends agents to report what's happening, they're saying, hey, these people are bringing in slaves. So the wealth of these colonies that are being established is based on slave labor, which was illegal in Mexico. So then people that are supporting these Protestant colonies that are founding up actually create an exception to allow slavery into Mexico because it's driving the wealth of places like what will become Austin, Texas, et cetera, et cetera. So there are some people that believe that it has to do with religion and culture, and then there are more critical people like Manuel Mediterrán, who goes to Texas. Everyone thought he was going to be president. He goes to Texas. He participates in putting down a few revolts with the help of Austin, and then he kills himself, and nobody knows why. But in his reports, he's saying, these people it has nothing to do with culture, it has to do with slavery. So you have two accounts. People who believe in cultural explanations would preach it, would say this has to do with religion. So it's definitely a language that's being developed. It's a language that's present and will become more present in the 40s. After the U.S.-Mexico War, all of that disappears, and you have like a more anti-American position, of course, that they argue that it had nothing to do with culture. It had to do with slavery, etc. So it's being talked about. People are talking about, it has to do with Protestantism, but the thing is, it also has to do with like capitalistic entrepreneurial habits and structures that were non-existent in Mexico or destroyed in Mexico by the war.
So it sounds like some of the bias of the Southeast, like Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, that came into Texas, and they're bringing a lot of their biases into it and reinforcing some of these stereotypes.
Right, and there were, existing biases in Mexico. So the people. So when they're inviting people to come. They're inviting the Americans, French, Irish. They're actually inviting a lot of Mexican indigenous populations to come from the south to come to the north and settle Texan lands. But they're also saying, the problem with opening our borders to bringing people in is that then freed black men from the U.S. can come down. So I'm not saying Mexico was not racist or anything in comparison to the U.S. It was, but they didn't have the same population and they didn't have like a strong institution of slavery like in the U.S. They had other forms of exploitation.
Any other questions?
Thank you.
Yeah, that's great.
Anyone else have any more questions? Particularly from students. I think Dr. Perez gave you double extra credit for questions from students.
Is that what's happened?
So I have a question, Professor, about the role of materialism. It seems that the definition of materialist needs is one of the major differences between the elite who are viewing the United States or this work ethic as more productive, whereas indigenous people, because they don't see this Western European mentality of homes and of materialistic objects, they don't see a need to earn a wage to produce things that they've survived for centuries without. So this oversimplification of work to live or live to work, which the United States is going through because of the pandemic,
We're trying to figure out what our place is in the labor force. But it seems that this idleness really can be reinterpreted as a conception of happiness.
Right. So two things. So one, an economic fact. We talk about John Tutino is a historian, economic historian. He has this work that says, we say the Mexican economy fell apart, right? And it did in numbers fall apart. But what happened was that what fell apart was the export economy. So commercial agriculture that was, that exported produce and stuff, that falls apart. And what actually happens is the development of more autarkic, more local, a local pattern of subsistence farming. So there's still farming happening, but people are now farming to survive and more like not producing to the market, right? So there actually agriculture boomed, but it was not commercial agriculture. And on that same point, but tying it to the indigenous aspect, the problem is that the ideas that we have and the ideas that a lot of these elite members of the elite have about free labor and what it means to work is that, okay, if I don't have a job here in Texas, I will, and there's jobs in Ohio, I'm going to move to Ohio because I need to find a job, right? But that the idea that you can move from one place to find a job in another place, implies a certain detachment to land, to community, to family. It's not as easy as picking up and saying, hey, I'll go to who's paying me better because I have a family, et cetera, et cetera. So people in indigenous pueblos, in communities, were not willing to just leave their community, even though they were farming their own food, they had their own food. They weren't, thriving. They were still going hungry. Sometimes they went and worked half the year in somebody's farm and came back, but they were not willing to leave this land, this unhealthy attachment to land. The scientific author I mentioned talked about, right? So there is definitely a different understanding of what it means to live and what it means to work. Do we have to abandon everything to find a job, or can we depend on other forms of other networks that are not necessarily economic? But these networks, non-economic networks that imply work, do not benefit ideas of development. So I study actually like you mentioned earlier, I study the perspective of the elite and of conservative thought, who did not consider these things. These were pre-capitalistic bad habits. These are things that are bound to disappear, but which actually are resilient and last well into today, right? If we look at Zapatista's company. So there were different ideas of what it means to live and what it means to work. And I mean, some of us are willing to live, depending, to leave a place to find a job in a different place. Others are not, people who migrate. I came from Puerto Rico to the U.S. That's technically not migration, but it is. That implies cutting a lot of ties, right? That are not easy to do. And I have friends that say, no, I'm not going to migrate. Things are hard, but I'm going to stay here because I'm attached to a place. So it implies different ideas of what it means to work, and that we're not in the 19th century or even well into today. People don't appreciate those other forms, conceptions of what it means to live well and to work well, right? What's good work? Yeah.
Anyone else? Actually, I have a question following up to all of you. Please raise your hand. How many of you were born outside of Texas? Raise your hand if you're born outside of Texas. So there we go. We got some reasons to not to be idle or be idle in West Texas.
I have follow-up questions. Why did you come to Texas, et cetera, et cetera? Right, there's something,
Anyone else? One more question? Please.
Okay, so thank you. That was a great talk, by the way. I only felt it
Yes, twice? It's better, I'm getting better at it. It's the images, was it the image? No.
It was the zooming in and out.
Yeah.
It was really good. So have you heard of some historians refer to Mexico as the orphan land? Have you heard of it?
No.
So I was thinking, as you were talking about this vagrancy, is that the term? Vagabundo?
Sí, vagancia.
Vagancia. So some people have, or some historians, and I think it's mostly in Mexico, they refer to the people there, the indigenous, as the orphan land, because they took away their richness, and like the Spain took away their gold, and they took their women, and all these other things that happened prior to the independence. And I was wondering if you haven't heard, do you have any insight as to if there is any relationship between this not having that stability?
So, yes. So, a lot. I mean, there's a lot of indigenous community. There were a lot of indigenous communities and cultures in Mexico, and the ones that, or many that were affected more drastically, whether earlier in the Spanish conquest or later, actually exactly become unmoored. Once you lose the land, and land, let's say land is privatized, these people get displaced. They move to the cities, and it's people who've lost not their attachment to their culture necessarily, but a attachment to a place. So they become part of this population that moves, and it's actually vagrant in the sense that it's unmoored, it's lacking ties. That's one part, and the other part is like sometimes people talk about, historians talk about, sort of like the second conquest, which happens after independence, second process of colonization, and especially this indigenous activist linguist Yasnaya Aguilar Gil, who gives the numbers about Spanish speakers. She said that this idea of mestizaje, that we are, the idea that we're all mestizo, that people say in Mexico, but they also say in Puerto Rico. This idea had little to do with race and actual racial mixing, but actually an educational policy that sought to destroy indigenous cultures, in the sense that, we are all, because we're all mestizo, we should all only speak Spanish. So there were educational policies in place to kind of create that unmooring, to separate people from culture or land. So it's a process that doesn't only happen under Spain. It actually happens well into the 20th century through a government that begins to create a national history based on the indigeneity. Also, our past is indigenous, but that's not our present, and therefore we have to be Mexican now. So there's like a weird relationship with indigenous culture and the destruction of indigenous culture. That's part of the creation of the Mexican identity as well.
There's a book by Bonfil Patay called Mexico Profundo, where he argues that the systematic marginalization of indigenous people might be somewhere where that concept came from. And there's also, from a popular culture standpoint, many Mexicans, at least maybe my parents' generation, would describe the beginning of Mexico, Guadalajara. Mexico City was owned by the Spaniards, and
right.